A sound cut through the howl of the storm, not wind, not the groan of the frozen eaves, but a fist against wood. 3 hard knocks, then silence, then 3 more, slower, as if the man behind them was running out of strength. Constance Howe set down her mending and did not move immediately. She had learned, in the 2 years since Thomas died and left her with 40 acres of hard frostfield clay and a mortgage that gathered interest like it gathered dust, that sounds in the night required thinking before they required action. The fire in the hearth was down to its last good log. The bread she had baked that morning was the last bread she could bake until the supply wagon made it through, which would not be soon, not in this weather. She had $8.30 hidden in the flour tin, and a pride that occasionally caused her more trouble than the mortgage did. The knocking came again, softer this time. She pulled her wool shawl tighter and went to the door. The man on her step looked as though the storm had been using him for target practice. Snow had packed itself into every crease of his long travel coat, dark leather, once fine, now stiff with frost. His hat brim sagged under the weight of ice. His face, what she could see of it above the scarf he'd wound around his jaw, was the color of old candle wax, and his lips had gone a shade of blue she did not like at all. "Ma'am." His voice was hoarse and not very loud. "I knocked at the Hanley place and the Decker place both. Nobody answered." He paused. "I saw your light." Constance looked past him into the dark. The storm was not a metaphor. It was a real, killing thing, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since sundown. She looked back at the man, at the frost on his eyelashes, at the way he was holding himself upright by what appeared to be sheer stubbornness rather than any remaining warmth. "Come in, then," she said, and stepped aside. He came in slowly, as a man does when his legs have been arguing with him for some time. She shut the door against the wind and bolted it, then turned to assess the situation with the pragmatic eye she had developed out of necessity. He was tall, taller than she'd judged from the doorway, and broad across the shoulders, though he'd lost enough flesh on the trail that his coat hung loose. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves, were red-raw and shaking. "Sit there," she said, pointing to the chair nearest the hearth. "Don't argue with me." He didn't argue. He sat, and she put the last good log on the fire and did not permit herself to think too hard about what she would burn tomorrow. His name, he told her once he could speak without his teeth rattling, was Eastonvale. He'd been riding from Caldwell, he said, and the storm had come on faster than the sky had promised. His horse was in her barn. She could charge him for the stabling, he said, and she almost smiled at that, because what she had in her barn at the moment was a plough horse with a tender hoof and 8 laying hens and very little else worth charging for. "Where were you headed?" she asked, handing him the cup of broth she'd heated from yesterday's pot. "Frostfield." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I have business there." "You're in Frostfield," she said, "such as it is." He looked up at her at that, and something moved briefly in his dark eyes, surprise, or perhaps reassessment. He had a steady way of looking at a person, this Eastonvale, that she found slightly unnerving and did not intend to show. His face, now that the blue had left his lips and some color was returning, was a weathered sort of face, not young, not old, a face that had spent considerable time outdoors and had the lines to show for it. "I'm obliged," he said quietly. "Most people didn't open their doors tonight." "Most people have more sense than I do," Constance said, and went back to her mending. He slept in the chair that night, because she had only one bedroom, and she was not about to offer it to a stranger, however frozen he had been at her door. She brought him the quilt from the cedar chest, the one Thomas's mother had made, and told him it was the spare, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of small mercy she permitted herself. In the morning she made porridge from what she had left of the oats and put a bowl in front of him without ceremony. He ate every bite. He said thank you. He offered again to pay for the stabling. "When you're on your feet properly," she said, "you can split the wood pile. It needs doing and my back has been saying so for a week. He split wood for 2 days. He was good at it, thorough and unhurried, the way a man works when he's done a thing many times and sees no use in rushing. He also patched the gap in the barn roof that had been letting snow in on Bessie and the hens, and he did it without being asked, which Constance noted with a complicated mixture of gratitude and suspicion, because in her experience men who fixed things without being asked were either genuinely good or wanted something. On the 4th evening, the snow eased enough to let in a watery grey light, and Constance was trying to inventory what she had left in the larder against what she would need to last another 2 weeks. It was not a comfortable arithmetic. Easton came in from the barn and glanced at the list she'd set on the table, then set his hat on the peg without a word and sat down across from her. "Tell me what's missing," he said. She looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "From the list. You're counting things." He nodded at the paper. "What's short?" She considered being offended. She decided it was not worth the energy. "Flour, coffee, salt pork. I can manage on what I have if the road opens by the week's end." "I'll go to town tomorrow morning and bring back what you need," he said. "Don't argue with me." She almost smiled at that. Her own words returned to her. "I'll pay you back when I'm able." "I know you will," he said simply, and that was that. He went to town and came back with flour and coffee and salt pork, and also, for reasons he did not explain, a small paper packet of dried apples that she had not mentioned and did not know she'd been missing until she saw them. She put them away in the larder and did not say anything about it, because she did not entirely trust her voice on the subject of dried apples just at that moment. It was in town she later understood that he had also sent his first letters, but that came later. On the 7th evening he came in from the cold and found her at the table with a letter in her hand and an expression she was trying very hard to keep composed. "Bad news?" he asked. "A man named Fordham Gill," she said, "has been purchasing debts in this county. He bought my mortgage from the bank in November." She set the letter down. "He is informing me that he intends to foreclose on the property in 30 days unless I pay the balance in full." She said it steadily. She was proud of that. Easton pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. He looked at the letter. "How much?" $240. She almost laughed. "I have $8.30. I had $8.30 before the storm, and I still have it, which I suppose is something." He was quiet for a moment. "This Gill, is he local?" "He operates out of Hatcher's Bend. He's been doing this throughout the county, buying distressed mortgages and pressing for quick payment. 3 families have already left their land." She folded the letter with precise, careful movements. "I am not leaving my land." There was something in the way she said it, flat and final, and not asking for an opinion, that made Easton Vale sit back slightly and look at her with that steady, reassessing look again. "No," he said, "I don't expect you are." She went to bed that night with the letter in her apron pocket, and the weight of it sitting on her chest like a stone. She had known the situation was precarious. She had not known it had a deadline. 30 days in February, in a frost-filled winter, with $8.30, and a man in her parlor who split wood beautifully, but was, as far as she could tell, in no position to help her with $240. In the morning he was up before her, and the fire was built, and there was coffee on, and he set a mug in front of her and said, "Tell me about Gill, everything you know." So she told him. She told him about the 3 families who'd left, the Morrises and the Carvers and old Mr. Phelps who'd homesteaded here for 20 years before Gill forced him out. She told him about the petition that some of the remaining neighbors had signed and sent to the county seat and received no reply to. She told him about Jonas Decker, one of the doors that had not opened to Easton in the storm, who'd told her privately that Gil had connections with certain men in the territorial government and that the petition was not going to help her. Easton listened. He asked precise questions. He did not offer false comfort or immediate promises, which she appreciated more than she could say, because she had received enough of both from well-meaning people to last her a lifetime. The days that followed had a particular quality to them that Constance could not quite name. Easton had no reason to stay, and he stayed. He worked. He ate at her table and said little that was unnecessary and listened when she talked, really listened, not the polite listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak. He knew cattle and weather and land. He did not know, apparently, how to let a conversation end badly, which she found restful. One evening she found herself telling him about Thomas, about the good years before his lungs failed him, and about the loneliness that had come after, the particular loneliness of a woman on a working homestead with no one to work it with. She had not meant to say any of it. It came out anyway. Easton did not offer sympathy in the manner she dreaded, the manner that required her to be grateful for it. He said, "He chose well when he chose you for a partner." He said it matter-of-factly, looking into the fire, and it hit her somewhere under the ribs in a place that had been very quiet for a long time. She picked up her mending. "You've been kind to say so." "I've been accurate," he said, and did not look away from the fire, which was good, because she needed a moment. What she did not know, what she had no particular reason to know, because he wore no ring, carried no card, and had arrived on her doorstep half-dead in a borrowed coat, was who Easton Vale actually was. She found out on the 12th day, because of the neighbor woman, Mrs. Bertram Fleck, who arrived on horseback through the thin sunshine of a brief thaw, and stood in Constance's kitchen with her eyes very wide. "Constance," she said in a low, urgent voice that was trying hard not to be a whisper, "that man in your barn. I rode past and saw him, and Constance, do you know who that is?" "His name is Easton Vale," Constance said, pouring coffee with a steady hand. "He was caught in the storm. He's been helping with repairs." Mrs. Fleck sat down very suddenly. "Easton Vale," she repeated. "Constance, Easton Vale owns the Vale Land and Cattle Company. He owns 6 ranches between here and the border. He owns the Vale grain contracts that supply half this territory." She paused. "My husband says he's one of the 3 or 4 wealthiest men in the region." Constance set down the coffee pot. She stood there for a moment in the middle of her own kitchen, in her worn wool dress and her practical apron, and looked out through the window at the figure moving around her barn with her plough horse's lead rope in his hand, checking the hoof she'd mentioned was tender, because he had noticed it was tender and had simply gone to see to it. She thought about the 8 days of wood splitting, the barn roof, the coffee he'd made each morning, the dried apples, the careful, precise questions about Fordham Gill. She thought about $240 and what it was to a man who owned 6 ranches. She felt something she could only describe as a profound and slightly indignant rearrangement of everything she had assumed about the situation. "Thank you, Hetty," she said, with great calm. "More coffee?" When Mrs. Fleck had gone, Constance put on her coat and walked out to the barn. Easton was wrapping the plough horse's hoof in a poultice cloth he'd made from something he'd found in the tack room. He looked up when she came in. "She's going to be fine," he said, nodding at Bessie. "Needed the pressure taken off. Another few days and she'll be right." "Easton," Constance folded her hands in front of her. "I've just had a visit from my neighbor, Mrs. Fleck." Something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, more the look of a man who has been waiting for a conversation to arrive and is not entirely unhappy that it has. "I see," he said. "She tells me you are not, in fact, a traveler of modest means." "No," he said, "I'm not." "You own 6 ranches." 7 as of last March. Constance looked at him. He looked back at her. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the barn boards with cheerful indifference to the human drama within. "Why didn't you say so?" she asked. It came out quieter than she intended. He was still for a moment. "I've been Eastern Vale, the landowner, my whole adult life," he said finally. "When I'm Vale of the Vale Company, people see the company. I was half dead on your doorstep and you saw a man who needed a fire and some broth." He paused. "I didn't want to change that." Constance absorbed this. She was a practical woman. She did not have the luxury of sustained outrage when there were real problems requiring real thought. She breathed out once, slowly. "The mortgage," she said. "Fordham Gill." "I've been making inquiries," he said. "I sent letters from town last week while you thought I was buying feed." "I did not think you were buying feed," she said. "You came back with no feed." He almost smiled. "Gill operates out of Hatcher's Bend. He has a pattern. He buys distressed debts, forecloses, and resells to a land syndicate that's been consolidating territory for a development scheme. The syndicate has a silent partner in the county land office, which is why the petition didn't help." He paused. "I know the man who owns the majority interest in that syndicate. We have had disagreements before. And I have a meeting with him in 3 days, when the road from Hatcher's Bend opens." She stared at him. "You arranged a meeting?" "I did." "About my 40 acres?" "Among other things." His voice was level. "What Gill is doing affects a great many people in this county, not only you. The choruses, old Mr. Phelps." He looked at her steadily. "I have resources. It would be a waste not to use them." The days before the meeting were not easy ones. Constance found herself wary of her own feelings. The way you are wary of a step you can see is soft. She knew who Easton was now, and the knowledge kept shifting the ground. It was one thing to warm to a frost-bitten stranger who split your wood. It was another thing entirely to warm to a man who owned 7 ranches, and had the kind of power that made other men arrange their chairs more carefully when he walked into a room. She said as much one evening, when they were sitting by the fire after supper, and she was trying to be honest with herself, if not with him. "I don't know," she said, "what to do with the difference between who I thought you were and who you are." He looked up from the piece of harness leather he'd been mending. He'd found something to mend every evening, which she had noticed and thought said something true about him. "What's the difference?" he asked. "The man I thought you were had nothing. I didn't have to think about why you stayed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I stayed because I wanted to. The size of my bank account doesn't change that." She looked at him. He looked back at her without performing patience, which was its own kind of answer. "All right," she said, and went back to her own mending, and the fire crackled between them with nothing unresolved. The meeting came on a grey Thursday, when the road had opened enough for travel, and Fordham Gill arrived in Frostfield with the confidence of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants. He came in a good coat and a hired rig, and he went first to the Decker place, Jonas Decker, who had not opened his door in the storm, and who had been quietly cooperating with Gill in exchange for favourable terms on his own debt. Gill came to her door mid-morning, with a man behind him who carried a document case and the expression of someone paid to look official. Constance opened the door before he could knock. "Mrs. Howe," Jill said. He was a heavy-set man with small eyes and a practiced smile. "I believe you received my letter." "I did," she said. "Come in." He came in. He stopped when he saw Eastern Vale at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers in front of him, and the practiced smile underwent a rapid and not entirely voluntary adjustment. "Gill," Easton said, not a greeting, an acknowledgement of a fact. "Vale." Jill recovered himself admirably. "I wasn't aware you had an interest in this property." "I have an interest in several matters," Easton said, "that we can discuss. Sit down." What followed was not the scene Constance had spent 2 weeks dreading. It was quiet and deliberate, and the quiet had weight to it. Easton laid out what he knew about the syndicate and the silent partner in the land office, document by document, in the unhurried manner of a man who has held better cards, and is only now choosing to show them. Gil's practiced smile was entirely gone by the time the third document appeared. The Morrises' property, Easton said. The Carvers, Phelps' homestead, Mrs. Howe's mortgage. You'll return clear title to each, with all interest forgiven, and you'll do it in writing before you leave Frostfield. In exchange, I won't take what I know about the land office arrangement to the territorial court. He looked at Gil steadily. You'll find I'm not an unreasonable man when I'm treated reasonably. Gil sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, I'll need an hour with my man here to draft the papers. You have an hour, Easton said. Constance sat by the window during that hour and did her mending, because her hands needed to be doing something or she would have put them over her face, and she would not give Fordham Gil the satisfaction of seeing that. She kept her stitches neat and even. Outside, the snow caught the thin winter sun and threw light back in soft, flat panels across her floorboards. Gil's man scratched away at his papers in the corner. Gil himself sat with his thick hands flat on the table and said nothing, and Easton drank his coffee and did not watch him, because he did not need to. When the papers were signed and witnessed and Gil and his man had driven away in the hired rig, Easton brought the documents to the table and laid them in front of her. She looked at them for a long time, the mortgage discharged, the title clear, 40 acres of Frostfield clay that were hers, fully and finally. Easton, she said. Yes. This is a great deal more than splitting wood. It is, he agreed. She looked up at him. He was standing across the table from her, hat in hand, and for the first time since Mrs. Fleck had rearranged all her assumptions, she let herself look at him without immediately sorting the information into something manageable. He was a man of quiet power. That was evident enough. He was also a man who had slept in her parlor chair and made coffee while she was awake and wrapped a poultice around her plough horse's hoof and brought dried apples when she'd said nothing about needing dried apples. I have 7 ranches, he said, and I have been lonely in them for a considerable number of years. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a hen made a comment about something, and Bessie shifted in the barn, and the Frostfield afternoon went about its business with complete indifference to the two of them. That, Constance said, is a very oblique way to say what I think you're trying to say. It is, he said. I'm better at cattle contracts than I am at this. She looked down at the documents and then back at him. Thomas had been gone 2 years. The loneliness of those 2 years had been a thing she'd folded up and put away, the way you put away things you can't afford to look at directly. She was a practical woman. She had $8.30 in the flour tin, and a mortgage that was no longer a mortgage, and a man standing in her kitchen who had seen her at her plainest and most threadbare and had stayed anyway, had stayed because he wanted to, as he had said, and she believed him. You could start, she said carefully, by having supper here tonight, again, and we could see how we feel about things over some time. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at her the way he had from the first night, steady, and with that quality of genuine attention she had not known she was hungry for until she had a steady supply of it. That sounds like a reasonable arrangement, he said. I am a reasonable woman, she said, as I believe I have mentioned. The warmth that came into his expression then was not the manufactured warmth of a practiced man. It was slower than that, and quieter, and it reached all the way to the lines at the corners of his eyes. He set his hat on the peg, her parlor, her home, and without any fuss at all he went to the woodbox and set another log on the fire, because the afternoon was cooling and it needed doing. She put the kettle on. He sat down at her table, Outside, the snow caught the last of the afternoon light, and the 40 acres of frost-filled clay lay clear and free in the early dark, waiting for spring. It was, Constance thought, with a warm and a slightly astonished feeling she had not expected to feel again in this life, a very good evening to have opened her door,